Japan just had a press release this week that they had more people die from suicide in the month of November or October or November. More people suicided in Japan than have died from COVID the entire time COVID's been around.
I mean,
for the entire year of COVID,
yeah,
more people suicided in a single month.
So, and, you know, if you guys listen to the podcast that I've done with Ivor, I called this invisible blood. And I really felt like this is just my soapbox. It's not necessarily Kirk's opinion, but he may agree with me. I really felt like from the beginning, politicians were overly strict and stringent because they didn't want to be held accountable for apparent COVID deaths, which was visible blood. And they could say, you know, with the impending election season, which thank goodness we all survived maybe at this point, they wanted to be able to say, hey, I saved COVID lives by doing lockdowns. But there was this invisible blood, the suicides, the cardiovascular death, that all these people will never be held accountable for, because nobody will ever really trace and say, you know what, by locking down the country, by choosing to do draconian stay-at-home orders or lockdown orders, which have been shown to not be effective, and I'll show you guys a whole index of that in a moment, you actually ended up resulting in more deaths via suicide. That's invisible blood. And it's not as politically charged. And that's really the tragedy, is that there's political issues at play here.
And you can't prove the negative, right?
Exactly.
Like you can't prove the negative occurrence. I mean, I'll show you this rock in my backyard. I can see it right here. And it repels tigers. There's never been a tiger in my backyard. I've had this rock in there for years. And so, like, how do you disprove that? You can't. I mean, it's logically obvious that, okay, if we're having more suicide, if we're having more homelessness, we have more drug problems. If we're having more psychiatric issues, you can almost certainly attribute that to the society that you've built. If you're having more drug addictions, more alcoholism, that's tied to both of those other things, right? If we're having more suicides, more deaths, more more self-inflicted deaths, whether they're intentional or not. I mean, overdoses don't have to be suicides, but if it's coming from the same psychological state and the same reasons, then who cares, right? And to your point, that's invisible blood, and people will point the fingers 5 years from now or 10 years from now. That's when people will look back and go, oh, that was really unhealthy. And then it'll just be nebulous, like, oh, some people overreacted. But I agree with you. It was, the unfortunate reality about politicians is that, as you say, their number one concern is how the public views them and how successful the public believes they have been, because that's where their job comes from the next year. I don't know what it'd be like if we had to be elected to be doctors every year. Like I assume that would change my behavior as a doctor somehow. I can identify that being a terrible way to go through your life, through your career, but it definitely influenced the decision making.
It would probably be inversely proportional to the number of prostate examinations you asked your patient.
Exactly.
I can guess, or, like whatever is
directly proportional to the number of opiates I prescribe.
Yeah, things that are horrible. And there's a quote that I'll butcher, which is, it's the idea that if a man's job and livelihood depends on an idea, then he's very unlikely to question the veracity of that idea in any way, shape, or form.
That's good.
And I'm just paraphrasing that. I'm sure someone will be able to point out the exact quote. If you guys are curious, again, shout out to Ivor. This is on his website. Published papers and data on lockdown, weak efficacy, and lockdown huge harms. There are no less than 20 papers here. The first one is from the Lancet. There's 22. These are all hyperlinked. And these are all papers suggesting that the lockdowns do not really have any benefit. And because ultimately what we're talking about is this, right? We're talking about a virus that is harming people, that is burning dry tinder in the woods, that is causing people to die who are susceptible. And we're trying to make reasonable, rational decisions about how we move forward. And I certainly don't think going back to lockdowns is the way to do this in any way, shape, or form. We'll leave masks for another day. Although, as you and I talked about prior to the podcast, we've had 40 to 50 years of efficacy studies on masks, which suddenly seem to be a whole lot less available and more difficult to find. And all you can find is the last 6 months. But whether
Yeah.
you're pro-mask or anti-mask, we'll leave it for another day. But the lockdowns are what really affect businesses and affect loneliness and affect addictions and affect our ability to be in community with each other. And so it's important to point out that there is a large amount of data suggesting that these are not effective. And yet my suspicion, as I talked about with Ivor and as we're talking about now, is that because this is a seasonal endemic virus, you guys can see if you look at the rates that the rates of COVID are going up and the deaths are going up a little bit because we're getting into winter now. And we know very well that vitamin D is tied to this. So we can talk about that before we wrap up as well. But there's no question that metabolic health is the determining factor and that vitamin D levels are tied to that. And I just think going back to lockdowns, which I fear our legislators, I fear this will happen again. It will not fix anything and it will harm so many of the things. So that's the collateral global information there, guys, if you want to find that.